James Taylor, and today I'll be doing the Exam 2 oral presentation. And so I'm just going to start off talking about Dr. Evan Ream and his research of the Guam brown tree snake and how it's affecting Guam and those surrounding islands, or comparing those surrounding islands with their bird ecology and stuff. And so the first thing to talk about is that he discussed the difference between a seed predator and a seed disperser. So a seed predator is a thing, or a bird species that actually destroys the seed. It eats it for the nutrients in the seed itself. And here in North America, the American goldfinch is a great example of that. And then they talk about seed dispersers, which is what they really focused on in this research. And those are birds that eat fruit or something else that has a seed in it. They're not going for the seed itself, and then they move it and drop it somewhere else on the island or in their habitat. And so a good example of that would be a cedar waxwing here in the US, or North America. And so they kind of did this research and went into things. They talked about the ecosystem services provided by these seed dispersing birds. And these birds really help create a structure in a forest, like a healthy structure. And they provide diversity by moving seeds back and forth from good to bad habitat or vice versa. And they also move seeds across boundaries that the seeds may not be able to travel on their own. And so they kind of move things back and forth and kind of between various different habitats. And so the study was based mainly around the idea of like multi-island comparison. So they compared Guam to a couple other islands that don't have snakes in that same area. And they did this to show what the island forest health and ecology look like with birds and without birds, and vice versa, like with and without the brown tree snake on it. And so that showed like a really good comparison of like how the forest structures have changed on those islands with the snake being there, especially on Guam, and without having birds. And so the biggest concern with the ecology, like when it comes to the brown tree snake, is that it was not the top predator where it naturally occurs, but when it came to the island, it is the top predator, and it eats everything, even its own kind. And so it spreads super rapidly. It's a generalist species. It's a nocturnal hunter, so a lot of birds nest at night or roost at night, easy targets. It's an arboreal species and it's super agile, and research shows that it actually has a new form of locomotion that science is just now coming around to figuring it out. And so the ecology of the brown snake being introduced onto Guam, just really how it functions, is the reason that the bird populations collapse. And so then at the end, they talk about how to reintroduce birds onto the island of Guam. And so they went through this whole process of the selection process to figure out what birds were best to reintroduce. And so they found all these seed dispersing birds, and they compared the species on islands with no snakes to see how they moved seeds back and forth, and did this by catching and banding, and using radio telemetry, and then seeing how they move between good and bad habitats and what worked the best. And so they ended up actually coming to the conclusion that the Micronesian starling was the best subject to reintroduce onto Guam to begin with, because there's already a small population at the military base, but to add those and then go from there as the snake population is reduced. And so just on this slide, that's a brown tree snake, and then that's a Micronesian starling. And so moving on, the next subject we're going to talk about is Doug Tallamy, Dr. Doug Tallamy, and his study on caterpillars and the Homegrown National Park. And so he asked this really big question of why do birds feed caterpillars to nestlings? And so there's 5 important things. One is that they are soft, so nestlings can digest them super easy. They're large, so you have a lot of substance for something for one meal. They're very nutritious. They're packed with all sorts of things. And then they have low percentage of chitin, so they're easily digested by nestlings. And then they also are the best source of carotenoids for birds to find. Birds don't naturally get carotenoids, and they naturally occur in plants. And because caterpillars are eating on these plants, they're able to kind of gather that nutrient in their bodies. And so he moves down the way and starts talking about how can we like protect these caterpillars because obviously it impacts our songbirds. And he came up with this idea of the homegrown national park. And so basically the premise of it is that everyone needs to plant natives, native trees, native shrubs, native grasses, all these things, flowers, in order to help the caterpillar population own private property. So the next kind of conversation in that is, why is he focused mainly just on private land? Well, the big thing is that private land is outside of the government bureaucracy. So you don't have to pass a law for things to happen. Like it can happen on its own. Plus, if you're east of the Mississippi, 85 to 86% of the land is privately owned. So you can't make a big national park or anything without imposing upon private government, imposing upon private people. And so by doing that, if you focus on private land to make this homegrown national park, you really succeed at kind of reaching something that the government can't do. And so that paper was actually really, really interesting. And then the last kind of topic we're going to talk about is who is polluting the world with plastic, and a paper called, excuse me, a paper called uh, Contamination of Coastal and Marine Bird Species with Plastics, Global Analysis and Synthesis. And this was by, I'm going to butcher their name, Ghulam Kibriya. And so this paper went through and talked about like all the different bird species worldwide that are affected by plastic pollution. And so the video talks kind of about the same thing, more on like a human scale and an island scale, that even islands are affected, even if they're not the ones doing most of the polluting. And so kind of the first question is, why are seabirds so affected by plastic pollution? And so this paper found that seabirds ingest high rates of plastics while fishing, while eating fish, eating mollusk or whatever, because bioaccumulation kind of occurs. But also they get entangled in a lot of these things, and they just come in contact with it more often than birds that are on the land. And then another big concern with seabirds is that they're unable to regurgitate plastic material. That sounds really odd, but I'm not really sure exactly what makes them not be able to regurgitate. They can regurgitate other things, but maybe it gets lodged. And then on top of that, seabirds are super susceptible to ingesting plastic and having both physical, chemical, and hormonal internal problems. They eat it, it cuts their gullets, cuts their throats, or it poisons them over time. And so these are all things that really affect seabirds more so than other bird species. And then in figure 2 of this paper, it shows the percentage of plastic ingestion of certain species worldwide. It doesn't show like pocket here, pocket here. It shows that pretty much all species around the world, if they're seabird or coastal bird, are affected by plastic pollution in some way. It's not like just here in the US or in China or however, it's everywhere. And so it kind of does show a few plastic hotspots, but it mainly shows that it's a worldwide issue. And it also shows that the higher percentage of ingestion equals a more at-risk category for a bird species. So if they found that it's ingesting a lot, that species ingests a lot more plastic than others, that's a big concern for like future conservation issues. And so then we talk about like, why is plastic so harmful to the Procelluridae species. So these are species such as they're mainly surface feeders, um, and they're so easily harmed by it because as they're feeding along the surface, they ingest plastic that's found along the ocean surface itself, and so oftentimes when it gets in their bodies, they ingest it, they have internal injuries. They can even die from it. And then you're looking at a population decline possibly from all of these deaths or illnesses. And then in general, you're just having possibly a lot of chemical issues as well because these plastics often leach chemicals that we don't fully understand. And so that's kind of a really interesting thing that a ocean surface feeding bird species or family is most affected. So I thought that was really fascinating. And then we get into the topic of kind of talking about like what kind of plastics are in my house. And so most of the things found in my house are bottles, and then containers. And so those things are usually polyethylene terephthalate or PET or slash PETE. High density polyethylene, which is ADPE, and then polypropylene, which is PP. So those are kind of the most common things in my house, and I feel sure in a lot of others because it's like milk bottles, that's detergent bottles, soap bottles, that's Tupperware. It's just a variety of things. And here in Oconee County, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Along with that, the other most common thing are wraps and bags. So trash bags, grocery bags, Ziploc bags, plastic wrap, all these things are super common. Those are considered low density polyethylene or LDPE. And all of these things release chemicals when they're out in the ocean and birds ingest them and things. And so um, neither of them are good. And the problem is that here in Oconee and pretty much everywhere, the most non-recyclable type is actually the LDPE, which is actually the most common type of plastic found in most people's trash or anywhere. And so there's this like large amount of plastic, these LDPEs, that you can't recycle. You have to just throw them in the trash. And so we have this like really large disconnect there of like there's a plastic that we don't can't do anything with again, so it just gets thrown away. And so I feel sure that's probably the most common thing that ends up in the ocean and probably has the most problems with birds. And so kind of after reading that paper, I was really kind of taken aback by how many different species are actually affected by plastic pollution. It's kind of crazy that it's a whole global issue, even though a lot of folks aren't the main cause of it. And then I really found that I thought that the idea or the research showing that surface feeding birds are most affected or most at risk was really fascinating because I kind of would have assumed that a bird diving down and eating a fish that maybe has a high level of concentrations of plastic in it would be more affected. But maybe these birds are getting a double dose because they are eating fish, but they're also getting these microplastics or just plastic into their systems while catching those fish. So that was something I didn't really think about. But I think it's really important to research a little bit more and see how that affects the future. And so I think that is everything. And these are the pictures cited. So the brown tree snake was from Scientific America, and then the Micronesian starling was from eBird. So I think that's it. Thanks for listening.